Okay. So hi everybody, welcome to the week 7 lecture for EDUC2065. I'm delighted to host today Jody and Lauren, who are from the Education and Care Regulatory Unit in the Department of Communities. They're going to be doing the bulk of the presentation today. And as we did last time with Tim's lecture, they might invite you at sort of different periods of time to ask a question. Please jump in. You don't have to show your video if you're not comfortable doing that, but if you unmute yourself and just blurt the question out, it really does make the session go really well. But if you're not comfortable doing that, then of course I'll monitor the chat window and you can type your question just so that we can make sure that you're getting the most out of their presentation today. And as I mentioned before, if we do accidentally get booted off, please don't run away. Please just come back and rejoin and I'll stitch the videos together for those people who are not watching us live. So I think with that, hopefully everybody can see the screen that Jody and Lauren are sharing. And with that, I'm going to hand over to you ladies. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name's Jody Gray. I'm the Quality Manager at the Education and Care Regulatory Unit, and I'm joined by my colleague Lauren Bowen, who's one of our team leaders here at ECRU. So look, thanks for inviting us today. Just before we start, I would just like to acknowledge that we're presenting to you today on Whadjuk Noongar Boodja and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Please do just jump in with any questions you have throughout the presentation. There's no need to wait until the end. So we've got quite a lot to get through, so we will work through at quite a reasonable pace. However, the presentation will be made available to you after today's session. So look, just getting started, I just want to do a bit of a breakdown of what is the National Quality Framework. So the National Quality Framework was a result of an agreement between all Australian governments to work together to provide better educational and developmental outcomes for children, essentially. The National Quality Framework introduced a new standard in 2012 to improve education and care across long day care, family daycare, preschool and kindergarten, and outside school hours care services. The delivery of the National Quality Framework is guided by set objectives and guidelines to ensure consistent and effective functions. So you can see on this slide here that the elements of the National Quality Framework include the law and regulations, the National Quality Standard, the assessment and rating process itself, the approved learning frameworks, which in WA are the Early Years Learning Framework and the Framework for School Age Care, which is My Time, Our Place. And there's a regulatory authority in each jurisdiction, so in each state or territory, and also the national body, which is a ECRU, so that's the Australian Children's Education and Care Quality Authority. So that's what the National Quality Framework is in a nutshell. That's sort of how it looks, I guess, from a structural perspective. So the governance arrangements under the National Quality Framework. So a ECRU is the statutory authority which guides and monitors the implementation and administration of the National Quality Framework to promote consistency across all states and territories. It's the ECRU's role to undertake assessment qualification assessments. So if any of you have been in that position where you've got overseas qualifications to work in education and care services, it is a ECRU who undertake those qualification assessments. A ECRU also undertake the training of authorised officers. So an authorised officer is someone who is employed under the law by a regulatory authority, and they are the officers who are responsible for undertaking assessment and rating functions. So they have to undertake authorised officer training, pass the training, and then annually complete drift testing to ensure that they, I guess what we call have a having that lens that is seeing what they need to be seeing in terms of rating and assessing services. A ECRU are also responsible for awarding the excellent rating. So that's the highest rating that you can achieve under the National Quality Standard, and it is a rating that you have to apply for based on specific criteria. They also undertake second-tier reviews of quality ratings. So in WA, we're fortunate enough that we don't get too many second-tier reviews. I believe we had 2 last year, and both of the original decisions made by the WA Regulatory Authority were upheld at that second-tier review. They also host the national IT system. So we work with with an IT system that it's a national system. Approved providers and services have one end of a portal, and we have another end of the portal. So basically that all comes together. They're also responsible, as I'm sure you're aware from their website, of publishing a lot of helpful resources, and they'll also undertake specific projects. So one of the most recent reviews that ECRU has taken on was the Australian government's child safety review. So that's in the process of implementation being finalised now. So our role at ECRU as the regulatory authority is we essentially have day-to-day contact with education and care services. We're responsible for assessing applications, so that includes provider and service approval applications. We assess all notifications that come in via that NQA ITS portal. We're responsible for undertaking assessment and ratings of services against the National Quality Standard. We monitor and enforce compliance with the national law and regulations. So that's quite a significant part of ECRU's role, and obviously our structure, which we'll show you a little bit more about in another slide. We undertake reviews of decisions that are made by the regulatory authority that are reviewable under the national law. And we provide sector support and guidance through, providing sessions such as this. We have a monthly newsletter that goes out to the sector. We do an annual roadshow as well, so that gets us out to providers and to educators to, discuss some of the trends and things happening in our sector. This diagram here is just an overview of ECRU's structure. So obviously we're part of the Department of Communities. We sit under regulation and quality. So that's essentially where all of the regulators sit. So we sit in with working with Children's Check, Standards Monitoring Unit, NDIS screening units, and a few others. So Natalie Galberti is the director of ECRU, and myself, as you can see there, is the quality manager. Our assessment team is the team that undertakes compliance monitoring and also the assessment and rating function. So we have 5 assessment teams. Each team has a team leader and approximately 5 assessment officers, and perhaps about 3 senior assessment officers and 1 compliance support officer within those teams. We have an investigations team in ECRU as well. So they're the team that take carriage of any higher level non-compliance matters. So when you see things in the media or some of the enforcement actions that are published, a lot of them are usually handled by our investigations team. I won't go through the rest of it, but you're welcome to have a look. So just to put some of that into perspective in terms of the work that this includes, so this is based on 2022-2023 data. So we received 1,276 applications. So 142 of those were provider approval applications. So that means somebody who is seeking to become a provider to be able to operate an education and care service. 128 new service approvals. So that means that in that particular financial year, we had a growth of 128 services. The big one, 725 waivers. The majority of waivers would relate to staffing. So as I'm sure you're all aware, and the sector would eagerly be awaiting for some graduates from the early childhood degree courses. A lot of those are for early childhood teachers. So unfortunately, there is a massive undersupply of ECTs in our sector, which requires services to seek a waiver to be waived from the requirement of an ECT and demonstrate why they can't actually employ an early childhood teacher. We did do 240 assessment and ratings in that year. Look, this year we're on track to complete 406. So yeah, absolutely, there's an increase in the number we're doing, which has a lot to do with our staffing numbers here. and also the refinements that were introduced in WA January this year to the assessment and rating process. So it enables us to undertake a partial assessment and rating, which means in essence we can complete more assessment and ratings. To enable us to actually work in the intended 3-year cycle, we need to be doing, I think it's about 367 visits annually to meet that 3-yearly target. So look, we've got strategic planning in place for that. Hopefully next year we will meet that target. Compliance monitoring visits, we undertook 687 service visits. So
1,680.
did I say?
You said 600.
Sorry, guys.
Much more than 687.
Look, a huge number. We have about 1,400 services, so we are getting out to services more than once. We go to our regional services at least twice annually, and one of the compliance tools that we utilise to monitor services is compliance monitoring plans. So those services do receive much more regular compliance monitoring visits from ECRU. We received 4,359 incidences and complaint notifications. So they range anything from being prioritised from low-level incidences and complaints through to those that are deemed to be high-level and require a significant level of investigation. So our investigations team had 94 cases passed across to their team last year. That resulted in 18 prosecutions in the State Administrative Tribunal, 1 cancellation of a service approval, 5 suspensions, 9 prohibitions. That means that we prohibit an individual from working in an education and care service, and also 14 exclusions of inappropriate persons. Breaches, there were 1,495 breaches of the national law and regulations that resulted in some kind of compliance action being taken. Does anyone have any questions on those before we move on to looking at the National Quality Standard and the assessment and rating part of the presentation?
I'll watch the chat and let you know.
Yeah, sure, Jemima, thank you.
No problem.
All right, I'll pass over to Lauren for this part.
So as Jodie mentioned before, the National Quality Standard forms part of the National Quality Framework. This is focused on quality assessment, and we can see that it's broken down into 7 main quality areas that range from the educational program and practice right through to the leadership and service management. In each of those quality areas, a service may be rated. One of these ratings up on the screen here, primarily you'll see that the 3 middle ones, working towards meeting and exceeding the National Quality Standard, they're primarily the ratings that are awarded to services. To receive an excellent rating, there are some criteria that need to be met, and it's an application to ECRU who will assess that. I don't think we've got any services in WA with significant improvement required rating. We've got 1. Ultimately, that's not something we see very much of. So 7 quality areas. Within those 7 quality areas, there are 15 standards, which are broken down into 40 elements. So across basically service practice, we would be assessing all 40 elements during an assessment rating period for a full assessment rating. We'll talk a bit more about the rest, partials as well. So the assessment rating process, it's got 4 steps. It starts with self-assessment and the quality improvement plan, the process for developing a quality improvement plan, followed by a desktop review, which is undertaken by an authorised officer to review the quality improvement plan and prepare for the visit, the actual visit itself, and then following the visit, there's an analysis of the evidence that's gathered, which is compiled into a report. A rating is awarded, and then we eventually publish that rating. So in WA, a new service receives a full assessment rating approximately 12 to 18 months after the service begins operating. The regulatory authority may choose to reassess a service after it's been assessed and rated at any time, essentially. It includes full reassessments of all quality areas or partial reassessments of a selection of quality areas. It could just be 1 element, it could be a standard, or it could be a whole quality area. These can occur once the service has had a full assessment rating under the current National Quality Standard, which was the refinements or the updated NQS, which came out in 2018. Okay, so as I mentioned, the process starts with self-assessment and a quality improvement plan. Ultimately, services will have varying processes for undertaking self-assessment, but ultimately the intention is to reflect on practices of the service in relation to what the National Quality Standard outlines is the expected practice. So services should conduct ongoing self-assessment. It shouldn't be a one-off process or something that they just set a date for once a year. It should be an ongoing process which will allow them to determine the quality of their practices against that NQS and the regulatory requirements. So whilst the National Quality Standard focuses on quality practice, it also considers compliance with the National Quality Framework. So it's important to meet the minimum requirements as well as aim for the best quality practice. Self-assessment helps to inform the development of a quality improvement plan, and there are templates available for this on the ECRU website. You can see how they might be developed. They're not compulsory, so services can use any template they like, but ultimately the intention of the quality improvement plan is to identify the service's strengths in each of the quality areas and in fact the standards and elements, and also to identify any areas for improvement. And it might not be that they're not doing something, but that they want to do something better. So the quality improvement plan captures that. The regulatory authority requests the quality improvement plan to be submitted prior to an assessment rating visit. Services will receive a phone call that says, we're going to be coming out next week. Can you provide your quality improvement plan to us within the next 24 hours? That allows our assessment officers, when they're planning for the visit, to review the practices at that specific service. And it's really important for them to have context about the service they're going to see. There's such a range of services, both service types and locations, that they're all very different. So over 1,400 services, you're unlikely to find two the same. So the authorised officer will review the quality improvement plan and use that to develop some prompts about things that they might want to see or might expect to see, and questions they might ask of educators and the centre leadership team when they're at the service. This happens anytime in the week prior to the visit, and the services are required to submit their quality improvement plan on the NQA ITS portal. Anything you wanted to add to that one?
I think as part of that desktop review, a really important component of that is an assessment of the services compliance history, and we also look at notifications that are made to us to see. There's often times services underreport things to us, so it's, you know, the bigger the service, the more notifications we'd expect to get, essentially, because we know children have accidents, we know parents make complaints. If services aren't reporting, then we somewhat get an inkling that there's some underreporting occurring. But a services compliance history contributes significantly to the assessment and rating process, in terms of, if, for example, if a service has received ongoing breaches for inadequate supervision of children, and we've taken various compliance actions, then we would use that to target our questioning, target our observation of supervision practices, have a look at what governance practices the approved provider has put into place to support the service team with something such as supervision, but it also does impact the overall rating. So a service can't have significant compliance history that is current and ongoing and be deemed to be meeting the National Quality Standard.
We also use the opportunity to, so as Jodie mentioned before, there have been some refinements to the assessment rating process this year in WA, which is basically allowing the regulatory authority to select to do partial reassessments for services who have had a full assessment under the NQS 2018. So compliance history will form part of the decision making around which quality areas will be assessed. So certainly if a service has a significant compliance history in relation to, say, the maintenance of the premises, then quality area 3 is likely to be assessed as part of the assessment process. Yeah. So then we look at the assessment rating visit. So that's the next step of the process.
I apologise,
Yeah.
Lauren. I might just invite everybody to jump off now, because we're going to get rudely interrupted in a moment. And
okay.
we'll come straight back in and we'll get everybody settled back on slide 12. I'm so sorry to do that to you, but I just don't
want
to
okay. That's
Thank you.
no problem. Miss any information. Won't be long.
Okay. Bye. Is everyone able to see?
All right, pick up when you're ready, ladies. I've started the recording again. Thanks everybody for coming back.
Everyone can see that screen. I just want to make sure that you can see what we're actually presenting.
I can see.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Probably a good place to pause anyway. So up to now, we've looked at the preparation for the assessment visit and the planning of how the evidence will be gathered. The assessment rating visit is the time where our authorised officers go to a service. So depending on the service type as to what that visit's going to look like and how long they're going to spend there. And ultimately, this is where they gather the evidence of service practices in relation to those 40 different elements of the National Quality Standard, all the ones that relate to the quality areas that they're assessing. So at a centre-based service, and that can be either long day care, or it could be outside school hours care, it could be vacation care, it could be after school care. There's lots of different options in relation to centre-based care. But ultimately, in those services, an officer will spend up to about 8 hours at the service for a full assessment and rating. And it's proportionate to the number of quality areas being assessed. So again, depending on how many and which quality areas, as to how many of those 8 hours a service will receive a visit from the authorised officer. It's also very, as I said, dependent on which quality areas, because if you are undertaking an assessment of areas that require a great deal of observation, that might be different to a service, an area that requires more discussion. So it's very varied depending on those things. Discussions are another part of the assessment and rating visit. So when an authorised officer is at a service, a centre-based service, they are spending primarily most of their time observing the children, the educators, and the practices that are occurring at that service. There is then a time schedule up to 3 hours, and it may be at the service, depending on the location of the service, or it might be done virtually, much like we are today, for key personnel at the service to have discussions with the authorised officer, primarily about things like relationships with families in the community, service governance and leadership, things that aren't necessarily observed practice during the visit. Family daycare services are another different type of service, and those have a principal office and then a number of educators registered to operate under that service approval, and those educators can be located anywhere in the state. So it's quite a broad range of service locations, or educator locations, I should say. And when we do assessment rating for family daycare, we visit a minimum of 10% of the number of educators registered with the service, at least 2. So if you've only got 2 educators, then we will still come and see 2 of your educators. We don't change that based on how many quality areas are being assessed. It's the same number of educators visited, but obviously the time spent with each educator will vary depending on what's being assessed. Similarly, there is a discussion that can take place for up to 3 hours, and it may take place at the principal office, or it may happen virtually. I'm not sure if there are questions about the assessment rating visit. That's usually the part that we get the most questions about, but yeah, pop them to the chat if you do. Okay. Following the assessment rating visit, our authorised officers will come away with that information, and there is a lot to collect, and they will start analysing what they've gathered with respect to the National Quality Standard. There's a really great resource that I would encourage anybody who's working or planning to work in education and care to have a look at, which is the Guide to the National Quality Framework. It's available on the ECRU website, and it's a resource that we and our authorised officers use a lot to help assess the practices of a service in relation to the National Quality Standard. So it's a really valuable document to use. Once they have analysed the evidence, they will write a report which will be edited, maybe moderated, so that we are using that common lens and making sure that the rating is reflective of the practices that were observed, before a draft of the report is sent out to the service and the provider, with an invitation for them to speak to us at some point within the following 2 weeks. So services have a 2-week period to be able to provide feedback on the report, to identify any inaccuracies, so maybe some things that the authorised officer has written incorrectly, captured slightly wrong, or to identify things that maybe haven't been considered but that were in place at the time of the visit. We obviously love to speak to services about the report when they've had a chance to read it and clarify their understanding of what those the content of the report is justifying in terms of the rating. and ultimately it gives them an opportunity to ask questions and establish whether or not they do need to provide any further feedback, because they don't have to. There are some other review processes, but ultimately if the draft report is accepted by the service and they don't intend to provide feedback, it's then finalised and then published on the ECRU website so that families nationally can actually see what rating the service holds, and it helps them to inform their decision making. A big part of the report are QUIP notes, and QUIP notes are basically guided advice that relate to the elements and standards that have been assessed, and they're really valuable as a part of the ongoing continuous improvement process. So that self-assessment that the service is always doing, that's informing the development of their QUIP, so they can add areas to improve upon or identify their strengths. These reports will include some guided advice in the QUIP notes for each standard that sort of go, hey, these are some things you might consider, and here are some resources that might be helpful for you in your ongoing improvement journey for this standard or this quality area. Part of that assessment visit, our officers are very experienced at navigating their assessment rating process, but we know it's a very sort of nerve-wracking time for some educators and for services, particularly if they haven't gone through it before or if it's been a long time. So things that you might expect to see if you're at a service when an assessment rating is occurring, you will see that the authorised officer will take a tour of the service, much like maybe a parent would, and they'll be introduced to the staff. They will spend the majority of their time observing the practice and speaking with educators. Now, if you're a student at a service or you're a new educator, they take into account your role at the service. They're not going to be asking questions that are left field, or if they do and they don't understand the context of your role at the service, it's perfectly okay to let them know, hey, I'm just a student, or I've only been here for 3 weeks, and then they can obviously amend their questioning and make sure that they're only asking things that are relevant to you. Okay, let's have a look. If you are at a service that's going through assessment rating and you're going out on an excursion or you're going on a bus run to collect children from school, chances are the officer's going to go with you. So I guess ultimately this is an opportunity for our officers to see every part of service delivery, and I guess it's just a matter of making sure that you don't feel surprised if they're going to tag along to something like the bus run for that day. I think that pretty much sort of, we have blown through that really quickly, but that's the assessment rating process in a nutshell. What you can see on the screen now are the different ratings that can be awarded. There is a bit of a formula to working out exceeding the national quality standard. We're proud to say that we do have a number of services in WA that hold an exceeding national quality standard rating. Don't ask me the number off the top of my head. It's going up. What we're finding is that even if the service doesn't hold an overall rating, they are certainly demonstrating high quality practices in some areas, and those are identified as exceeding themes against a standard. So whilst you can see there's a formula to determine how an overall rating of exceeding is awarded, and even at a quality standard, quality area level, we are seeing an increase steadily in different areas of the quality practices that are being observed during the assessment rating process. So we've compiled some examples, and Jody might help me here with some of these, just to give you an idea of some of the things that we might see in relation to the different ratings that might be awarded. So these are some practice examples of things that have been identified at service assessment rating visits that demonstrate those ratings.
So I guess this working towards examples. So if a service isn't meeting any element, that gives an overall rating of working towards national quality standards. So this is just an example taken directly from a report where working towards was identified for this particular element. So look, essentially the officer will highlight what it was that justified the working towards rating, and you can see that just by reading that there. The process itself, the assessment and rating process itself, does enable the application of minor adjustments or inconsistent practice to be applied, which in some ways is there to prevent working towards if it's something that doesn't pose a risk to children and it's easily rectifiable. So we do apply that particular policy regularly as part of the process. But look, unfortunately, if an element's not met and there's no way around it being not met, then that results in working towards rating.
So in this example, the element that needed to be met stated that there is an effective self-assessment and quality improvement process in place. What that means, what it looks like, and how you might meet the standard is unpacked further in the guide to the National Quality Framework. And it gives some tangible examples of what that might look like. And in this case, you can see that they didn't have a regular ongoing self-assessment process, which created goals and strategies for ongoing quality improvement, hence the working towards rating. Now we have an example or two examples of what meeting the National Quality Standard might look like. These are in relation to Quality Area 1. Quality Area 1 is the only quality area that has 3 separate standards. This one is in relation to intentional teaching and scaffolding of children's learning. And you can see that of the 2 examples that we have up there, it's about how educators are engaging with children in meaningful ways to support and extend their learning. And that's ultimately what the element was about. Similarly, in the second example, it's about opportunities to extend children's learning through open-ended discussions, questions, and feedback, using children's ideas to extend their own learning. As I say, you'll have a copy of these in the presentation that will be shared with you, so you can go back and unpack that. And it might be a good opportunity to have a chat to one another about your understanding of what you can see in those examples. Exceeding is one that we get a lot of questions about, and it's actually, I think, challenging in the sense that it's so different depending on the service context. So there's no formula for exceeding. You don't have to check X number of boxes before you can demonstrate that you're exceeding the National Quality Standard. It is very much based around 3 themes. So you can see here, the first theme is that practice is embedded in service operations. Now, it's not just any practice. It's not just about being consistent in doing a certain thing. It's about high quality practices that serve to promote best practice outcomes, quality outcomes for children. The second theme requires that a service undertakes critical reflection on their practices to inform, some of those changes that might occur to improve and make high quality practice for children. And the third one is about meaningful engagement with families and or the community to support the critical reflection and the high quality embedded practice. So you need to, a service needs to demonstrate all 3 of those practices in relation to a standard for an exceeding rating to be awarded. And ultimately, those practice examples are going to be very different based on what the needs of the service are and what they've identified when they're reflecting on their practice. Did you want to talk anything?
Yeah, look, I guess with exceeding services, the high quality practice and the intentionality of practice is probably what separates that, because they've gone through that process of critical reflection. They have that engagement with community, with families that is really truly meaningful to impact that practice. So all educators, it aligns with the services philosophy, and all educators are very aware of what that philosophy is and what that looks like in terms of their practice. They're able to articulate why they do what they do, and it's just this very organic, intentional approach to education and care. And that has to be the same across all rooms in a service, for example, and across all 7 quality areas. So, as Lauren said, we do have some services that will get some exceeding themes throughout the National Quality Standard. However, the majority of services that are high quality services, they're doing it well, and they're doing it well across multiple quality areas because they're all very interrelated. First and foremost, you need a really strong leadership at a service. You need a really strong collaborative team of educators to be able to underpin that high quality practice. Before you start seeing it in quality area 1 and quality area 5, for example. So yeah, it's a really great achievement for those services that have achieved exceeding National Quality Standard ratings. And yeah, look, it's very indicative of the work that's put into the process.
And look, ultimately, the service philosophy is going to be a big driver in, identifying areas for the service to improve in. It's the decision maker, it's the why behind the practice, and educators and service staff having an understanding of that and how it applies to the work that they do and the practices that they're putting into place is sort of the cornerstone of seeing the higher quality of practices more consistently across the whole service.
And you'll see those services who are exceeding services, their philosophies have incorporated obviously the principles and the practices from the approved learning framework. So you can see that they're written in the service philosophy as well. So there's that very holistic approach to practice.
So this is the third theme we were talking about, where practice is shaped by meaningful engagement with families and or the community. It doesn't have to be both, it could be one or the other, but ultimately it's about the context of that standard and their practices in relation to whatever standard it is that we're looking at. In this case, it's for standard 6.2, which looks at community engagement. Yeah, it is. But what you'll see in these examples is that there are very specific things that are going on that the service can actually reference. And it's particular to what the needs of their families and local community might be for that service. So when services ask us, you know, how do we demonstrate exceeding, there's not a very specific answer to that question, because it depends on what their reflections are telling them about what the needs of their families, children, service happen to be.
And I think this particular service here, just to give some context around this one, you know, their practices are in response to EDC data. So literacy is one of the vulnerable domains that they've identified for their area. So they're very heavily involved in community initiatives such as Paper Town Read program to support early literacy in children there. And you know, they're very committed to reconciliation.
So Quip Notes. Quip Notes, I think, are probably the most valuable outcome from an assessment and rating visit. As I said before, they basically provide some guidance and some objective feedback about where a service might be in their improvement journey. As we've just seen with exceeding, you know, it is a journey. You have to start somewhere. You have to start with maybe engaging with the relevant people, and that could be subject matter experts in relation to the standard that you're reflecting on, and talking to them about what is the best practice, and then reflecting on your own practice about how that can inform, you know, the next steps on whatever journey they happen to be on for that standard. The Quip Notes, as I say, are just that. They are notes, they are guidance. They, you know, services don't have to do them. They're not a directive. They are advice to support the service to take steps towards the next highest quality practice they can potentially endeavour to achieve. So you can see these are some examples of Quip Notes that have been offered to services in the past. And ultimately, it recognises some of the things that they're already doing really well and other opportunities that they might pursue to further improve practice. It may or may not include links to resources that are available more widely online that maybe the service haven't considered, and that contain information or tools that might support them in pursuing further learning and professional development in those areas. That's it. That's all we've got for you, unless you've got some questions. Anybody want to throw something at us?
Well, while they're having a think, and maybe some might start typing, I had a couple of questions just as you were going through. Firstly, just thank you both for your clearly deep knowledge and experience in supporting all sorts of different childcare services across the state with their rating process. I think for a lot of the students, you know, hopefully we've got some potential educational leaders amongst our group who are, you know, looking at entering the profession. So it can be a bit overwhelming to be able to go into that space. But a lot of them, you know, some of them who are not actually live with us here today are at a childcare centre working today. So and other roles like that. So some of them will catch up on this lecture later on and do bring some experience with some, particularly that assessment and rating process. So they will get a lot out of that presentation. So thank you for that. I just wanted to ask, just based on your expertise and your knowledge of the rating process, are there any particular quality areas or standards, or even just drill down to elements that Western Australia does particularly well, or is there one that's just a doozy one that is like, oh, that one again, we see this cropping up a lot? Like, are there any trend lines in terms of things that we can celebrate and do really well, or ones that kind of everybody's working on to improve? Is there anything you can share?
I guess the trend is national in terms of what quality areas are most commonly not met, and that sits in standard 1.3. So it's usually 1.3.1 or 1.3.2, which is around the cycle of planning and critical reflection on children's learning as individuals and in groups. So that unfortunately just comes back down to people's understanding of what a cycle of planning looks like, how it's documented, how it's actually followed through in terms of being a complete cycle for individuals, and also that critical reflection on, the learning, the progress towards learning outcomes, and all of those sorts of things that aren't being captured when somebody's critically reflecting on
Not
an individual
the next
cycle.
action.
Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting that it comes from the education quality. That surprises me. Yeah. So nationally
is nationally #1, and it has been since the introduction of the National Quality Standard. That aligns obviously quite closely with the element in Quality Area 7 for the educational leader, because that implementation and overseeing and implementation of the cycle of planning sits as an educational leader's responsibility. So unfortunately, when that's falling down, so is the role of the educational leader somewhere. So really difficult role being the educational leader, but it's really about, educating your team of educators and supporting them in their professional knowledge, because we know that, the educators range from working towards a Certificate 3 level through to having our degree qualified educators, and there's a huge knowledge gap between educators, so they do need to be supported in those roles, which is why we have that educational leader role. But it's a huge undertaking for the educational leader.
Yeah. The third assignment the students are starting to think about or panic about and plan is interviewing an educational leader, and a lot of the placements at the moment sort of building up 1 day a week, building up to a couple of weeks, and so that might be a good question that they might like to throw out there is, what are those challenges that they face, or, what are areas in terms of meeting your NQS requirements in terms of what is most challenging to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where looking at the guide to the National Quality Framework would be ideal, because there'll be some.
And we have shared that. They've got that in Blackboard, but I'll highlight that for them again. It's already been shared to them, but I'll make it a feature so that it triggers some memories for them.
Do they get it as a digital resource or an actual? Yeah, digital resource is great. We love that you can do a bit of a search and find function there, and that there's hyperlinks in the contents page, so you can go straight to the one you want. So the educational leader sits in 722 is the element that it relates to, of each of those elements that you can it might help with that. And ultimately, the way that an educational leader supports, mentors, guides educators in regards to the educational program is different at every service. So I think it's really great that hopefully students will get a bit of a broad range of experiences, and if they share those, you'll get a bit of a bigger picture in what that looks like.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, look, nobody's written in the chat, and I'm sure it's a lot of information. And as I said, they are just coming back from a break, so I'll excuse them unless anybody else has got a last question. They can't get away with it in the tutorials, because I'll engage them with each other. But this is a different format, so I appreciate that everyone's in a different mode. So very deep thank you to you both. Thank you for your time, and thank you for the recording and for the slides, the students, and I really appreciate it. And Tracy as well. So
no problem at all, our pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. Good luck with your studies. Good luck. See you later.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks, ladies. Oh, everyone's saying thank you in the chat to you.
Very welcome. All right, until next time.
Bye.
Okay,
I'll
bye.
stop the recording now. Thanks, everyone.